Thank you for joining us for another episode of This or That. Today, Brian and myself are going to talk about different types of corals, care requirements, what tanks they're best suited for, so you can make the right decision for your current tank or maybe an upcoming build.
All right, so we're talking about coral types, and I think it's good to start with sort of the difficulty topic. And there are always exceptions to the rules in all these different types of corals, but classically, you start with the easiest, which are going to be your softies, so zoanthids, leather corals, things like that. Then you move up to LPS, you get into your philias and that type of thing. And then the natural progression is eventually most people dive into the SPS world, which is considered the most difficult. Now, like I said, there are always exceptions to that rule. But if we're talking about, let's just say soft corals, like I said, zoanthids, things like that, those are some of the easiest corals out there to take, your classic leather coral, sarcophyton, like what you got back here, cabbage corals, things like that. They're going to be very, very simple to care for. They can really handle a lot of swings in water quality. They're going to be very forgiving for you. And if you do mess up, they'll usually snap back pretty quick. Now, again, I think the important thing to remember is there's always exceptions to that rule. They are not always going to be that easy, right? You get some things like xenia and stuff like they'll just grow like wild, right? Or star polyps, things like that. Sure. These guys are going to go nuts. They're going to grow really well, even in most situations. But you start getting to some of the more really interesting stuff, like some of the nepthias, stringonepthias. What are the tree leathers or some things like that. You're going to start getting into some more difficult corals that aren't as forgiving, require more pristine water quality.
Agreed. Yeah. So as a whole, it's a good thing to keep in mind, especially again if it's your first tank or you're just getting into coral. These types of corals, soft corals specifically, are more hardy to changes in water quality or higher nutrients. So your success chances are much greater starting with some soft corals.
Yeah. And then we talk about the next sort of most, I guess, interesting topic there, or most important topic that most people take into account when they're starting in the coral world is cost, right? So on average, and again, this varies, you start getting to some of the really cool mushrooms, bounce mushrooms and some of the really vibrant colored stuff. You could start, I've seen mushroom corals go for $200, $300, $400. So, which is crazy. It's awesome. But most of the time, things like zoanthids, leather corals, those are going to be pretty easy to enter into because they're not too expensive. And a lot of times you may have a friend in the hobby that's willing to just give you a piece, right, to try and see how it goes. So cost is usually a lot less on these guys.
No, that's a good point. Initial cost is lower. They typically grow and or spread faster, so you're going to fill your tank out quicker.
Yeah. So the maintenance on them isn't usually too high. You're not going to have to worry about and really focus on some of that water quality. You're not going to probably, if you're just doing softies, again, unless you're going for a very specific thing like really vibrant, say mushroom garden or something like that, where you're one of these just wild colors popping, probably not a lot of dosing and things like that you have to do. But, you still have to take care of it. Now, the thing that most people, I think, kind of mess up on or have trouble with when it comes to softies is because they think of softies as an entry-level coral. They think, a small tank is also an entry-level tank, so I'm just going to get a small tank for my softies. Now that works for some. That works great for some, but keep in mind these corals, some of them are going to grow really fast, and which means in a small tank you're going to have to trim them back. You're going to have to prune those things back quite a bit. A nice, beautiful leather coral is a great example, but within a year, that thing's going to be huge if everything's going well. Your star polyps, your button polyps, they're going to start growing all over everything. And a lot of times what you see people doing all the time, it's just like throwing a fish in, like a damsel or something just to see how it does in your aquarium. Eventually you have to try to get that out. And sometimes that's the same thing with soft corals. You throw something in there, you're like, we'll see how it grows. Then it takes over and you're like, okay, I don't like that anymore because it's too much work.
Very good point. Yeah, so a lot of them are very difficult to remove, trim. It's almost impossible for many soft corals to get them completely out of your tank.
That's true. Yeah, that's absolutely true. A great example, xenia is a great example, right? If you've xenia or anthelia, if you've put those in there, it doesn't take much. It takes just like a little tiny bit of the tissue. And again, that's one of the nice things about soft corals, but one of the bad things, it just takes a little tiny bit of it. It's like, hey, I'm coming back now, right?
Exactly. So let's move on to the next, we'll say like natural progression. So we've got our soft corals, they're doing well.
Yeah.
I want to try out some LPS or large stony
Yeah.
polyp corals.
Yeah, so that's usually the next progression, and you're getting, and one of the reasons it's sort of that next one is typically, and again, this is all fairly general, but typically you're going to have to worry about your water quality a little bit more, right? And these corals, and in my opinion, some of the LPS corals are even less forgiving than SPS, but these are going to be not, less forgiving than your soft corals are. They're not going to recover as well, and they're generally going to be more expensive. Now, you can find some. There are some that are starting to drop in price. Of course, some are going up, like some of the really beautiful torch corals, some of the different euphyllias. You can still get some nice trumpet corals, like we've got some back here, and even bubble, elegance, galaxia, all these other things, and some of even the encrusting ones that you can get for decent prices, really, and see how they go. And that's a great way to start before getting some of these larger ones, like before spending $100, $200, $300 on a really beautiful torch coral. Maybe get yourself something a little bit simpler, right? Get yourself some favia. Get yourself a favites coral and see how it goes.
Right.
See how it does and make sure it's growing okay. Try a trumpet coral. Usually those are a lot cheaper, and just see how it does. But keep in mind, again, all of these are going to get bigger, especially some of the euphyllias, the branching euphyllias. They're going to form in these massive colonies, right? And if you've got a really small tank, eventually that's going to get out of hand. You're going to have to prune that guy back quite a bit, which, as a person that's had to do it before, it's just heartbreaking. You're like, oh man, I've gotten this, look how well this thing's growing, and now I got to just hatchet it all apart. It's just like, it's terrible.
Exactly. So there's also the considerations of, now that we have coral with a skeleton, we're looking at some type of 2-part dosing once our water changes can't keep up.
That's right. Yeah, now if you've just got 1 or 2 in there, your water changes are probably going to be able to handle that, right? As long as you're doing regular water changes to replenish that calcium, magnesium, and alkalinity, pH are all staying fairly stable as possible. You'll probably get decent growth if you've only got a few of these in your tank. Now, it's the bug. So, once you start buying, you're like, oh, well, I want more of those, right? Favias are a great example. You're like, I want one of those. And it starts growing really well. And you're like, I want 75 of those. And so you start getting every color of them. And then all of a sudden now you're that calcium, that nutrient demand is a lot higher. You got to start making sure that you're dosing and you're keeping up on that. So there's another cost that comes into it.
Right. They're also less adaptable to changes in water quality. So now we need to make sure our filtration is up to par.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. Especially if you've got a heavily stocked aquarium with a lot of fish in there, you got to make sure that you keep those nutrients in check. Of course, we've long learned that you don't have to have them down at 0, but you can't have them getting overboard, right? That'll start to have negative effects. Everything will just start to look pretty crummy in there. And then you get all the algae and everything else you don't want. But I will say, in my personal experience, when it comes to LPS corals, have always been the least forgiving for me. If something goes wrong, in my experience, when something has gone wrong with an LPS coral, for me, it's always been the hardest to pull them back out of it. And if they do, it takes a long time.
Sure. Interesting, because I've had, I would say, the opposite experience, whereas I rarely struggle with LPS corals.
Right. Mine's usually, Softies never had a problem with most of them. There's a few weird ones out there that for some reason just are really finicky. But SPS, I don't know. For me, it's like SPS is different.
There we go. So let's hit that final stage of natural progression. We've got soft corals. We've mastered our LPS, which is our 1-2 recommendation. And then my preferred area, because I like a challenge, SPS corals, small polyp stony corals. We've mastered our 2-part. Our filtration's in check, and we want to step into these.
Yeah. So it comes with several other things. One, you've got to start increasing your flow a little bit more, where your soft corals, your LPS corals, most of them can handle very low to moderate flow rates. Some of them, again, you get some nice torches and things like that. You want them really having some of that nice movement, but too much will damage them pretty significantly. So you want to be careful of that. But as far as SPS goes, it takes a lot to kill them, and you can usually tell when you're putting too much flow to them. They just, the tissue starts to look thin, and then just reduce the flow, and they're usually fine. But yeah, it comes with a lot of additional things. So it's usually stronger lighting, more flow, more dosing, all these other things. That all said, that's the difficult part of it, is that it's usually more expensive and more time consuming to keep up on the water quality and the water parameters than it is for some of these other corals, which are typically a little more forgiving. And as long as your aquarium's stable and the parameters are stable where they're going to be, SPS is actually really easy. It's just, they're not going to appreciate those swings. You know, if things are moving when they're not, you know, pH is swinging, alkalinity is not stable, they're not going to appreciate that. You're not going to see the growth. You're not going to see the color. But as long as you can keep everything stable, usually it's really not that bad. But the barrier to entry is the additional cost and work.
Yep, so cost is gonna be a lot higher.
Yep.
There are a lot more, in my opinion, color variations that look really nice and natural. The satisfaction from growing out your tank, though, is obviously much slower, so they grow considerably slower than your soft coral and your Euphilia or LPS coral.
Yeah, and I think it's the same, too, as anything else. Because they grow small, a lot of people will pack them into their aquariums, you know, just stuff them as tight as they can in there because they're like, oh, you know, in 6 months, this will be too big.
Yep.
Well, then you have to start making some really tough decisions, right? In 6 months, you're like, well, which one do I keep? Or which one do I, you know, snap off at the base and call it a day with? You know, so always keep that in mind because these colonies are going to continue to grow. They don't, as long as everything's going well in your aquarium, they don't care how big it is. They're going to grow to the edges of it and keep trying to grow. They'll grow all the way up to the top of the water and stop. So, and the same can be said with any of them, LPS, SPS, all that. But again, ask yourself, am I going to be able to choose which one of these I pull out of here or break in half or get rid of completely or flat out just try to kill because it's maybe affecting the others, right? Maybe it's this really cool encrusting Monty that I loved 6 months ago, but now it's killing this Acropora colony that I love even more. How do I get that out of there?
Exactly, and all of us will run into that at some point.
It sucks.
All right, so hopefully we've helped you make the right decision for what we recommend for natural coral progression for either your first coral tank or an upcoming build.
Absolutely, guys. Again, thanks for watching. If you have any questions, throw them in the comments.
And we'll see you next time.